The cases that cannot be solved by negotiation can create much greater problems and sometimes require more original solutions. One of the early cases I had was also the hardest case I ever dealt with. And I would say it turned into the classic situation of an Agunot whose husband had disappeared. This couple was from Monsey, New York, Ir HaKodesh, as people may be familiar with the place. Well-known families. And he, let us say, had mental illnesses. Although one of the issues that can come up with mental illness is that a psychiatrist can lose their license for giving a diagnosis for someone that they haven't personally examined. So if you have someone who's mentally ill and refusing to give a get, he's not likely to submit to a psychologist's examination as to whether they're mentally ill or not, right? So that leads, or can lead into difficulties, or find someone that doesn't care, right? And, they're willing to risk their license on it, or someone who's retired. But this man was extremely abusive, not physically, emotionally abusive, and disconnected, and all sorts of emotional issues that he had. And I was told by Rav Mordechai Tendler, who was Ramesh Shamash, that he felt there was a reason to say that there was Kedushei Taos. There was a mistake in the initial stake in the contraction of the marriage, and therefore he felt like I could find a heter based upon that. Now, Kedushei Taos is a subset of Mekach Taos, a false sale. For instance, if I want to buy something, and I'm wanting to buy X, and you sell me something that isn't that you present as being that. For instance, I say I want a cow for plowing. They didn't use horses, they used to use cattle, right? And he sells me a cow that is uncontrollable when under a yoke, right? He says, I thought you wanted to shecht it. Right now, if I didn't say what I wanted it for, he's got a legitimate complaint. You didn't say you wanted it for plowing, right? But if I said I wanted it for plowing, and I have witnesses that say I wanted it for plowing, he sells me a cow that cannot be used for plowing, can only be used for milk or slaughter, right? I have a legitimate complaint to say this is an invalid sale, right? You get your cow back, I get my money back. Or, this is in the Chuvas of the Bali Tosfos, a man has a bronze ring that looks gold that he gives to a woman to marry her. And she, of course, assumes it's gold because no people are normally married with a gold ring, right? And he had the bronze made specifically so it would look gold, right? So that the assumption that every woman who's getting married is that she's receiving a gold ring. Well, nowadays there are all sorts of things, but let's go back 1,000 years. It was always assumed to be a gold ring, right? If it's not a gold ring, she has a complaint. This is not what I was expecting. It's an invalid marriage. So if the person is mentally ill, let us say, right, in a way that no normal woman would want to be married to such a person if she knew about it, right? And he was ill before the marriage was contracted, and she left after she found out about it. It's an invalid marriage. Now, listen, if I receive something that isn't but let's say the woman received the ring. She realized it was bronze and not gold, and she waits 3 years and says, wait, this is a bronze ring. You had mechil on it. You forgave your claim, right? Because you've known it for 3 years. You wanted to bring the claim, you have to bring the claim. You can't stay living with the guy and then suddenly say, 3 years after the fact. So, in any case, I wrote a very long tshuva, 54 pages long, saying that this should be Kiddushei Tav.
How long were they married?
I don't remember, but they were separated for 15 years. It was a long time ago that I did this case. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't convinced about the validity of the tshuva. I took it to several Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael who did not agree with the heter. So I said, well, if I can find the guy who's been missing for about the last 13 of those 15 years, then I certainly have enough information that I can force him to give a get. All right? And so I started trying to look for him. One of the things that the woman had told me is that he had her smuggle gold into Eretz Yisrael from Switzerland by having pockets sewn on the inside of her dress. And as I looked into this, I heard rumors that he was involved in smuggling both gems in and out of Israel, which, if you avoid paying the taxes on it, you can be a very significant amount of savings involved with this, as well as drugs from South America. So several years earlier, a woman had called me up. She wanted to get from her husband, and I said, oh, I'll call him up. See, he said, be very careful. The guy's in the mafia. You have to be careful with this guy. I said, fine, I'll call him up, see what happens. So I call the guy up, and he immediately starts cursing her. Like, as the English phrase is, to make a sailor blush. And I didn't interrupt him. I let him go on and on and on and on. Finally, when he paused, I said, I agree with you 100%. She's a really horrible, awful person. But you should know, as long as you're married to her, all of these atrocious traits she has, you're connected to her. That will infect your life, make your life miserable and horrible. You really want to get rid of her. So then we started having a conversation. After a while, he said, I have an appointment, I have to go. And then he said, call me back next week, and he gave me a time. So we continued to have 1-2 conversations a week for 6 weeks. And finally he said, all right, I'll give her a get if I don't have to see her. I said, no problem. Did the get al yidei shaliach. We're fine. 6 months later, about 8 months later, the guy calls me up. He is so happy. It's the best thing he ever did in his life. Mm-hmm. He got a promotion at work. Got a promotion at work. He has a new girlfriend, and he's really happy, and he wanted to talk to me about something. He wanted my advice on something. And every few months he would call me up for many years. And like a year later, a woman from Miami calls me up whose husband doesn't want to give her a get, and she's wondering if I can help. And I go, you're on the other side of the country. What do you want from me? Da, 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 da. Her husband is also in the mafia. She knew this other woman. So I called this guy up. I didn't want to ask him favors, but something like this, I called him up. And I was sort of hemming and hawing around it. And he goes, this guy doesn't understand it's in his best interest to give his wife a get? I'll explain it to him. At the time, there was a woman who was an assistant U.S. attorney going through gear in the Beit Din. And, I have regular meetings with people, and I asked this woman, assistant U.S. attorney, about this guy. And she goes, he's really high up in the mafia. We would love to get him for something, anything, but he's a banker, like we can't pin anything on him. All right. Shortly after this, I get the case that I was started with. And first I go to the U.S. attorney and I said, is it possible, this guy may have been involved in smuggling in Europe. You can ask Interpol if they know anything about him. And she explained to me that that was impossible because they're not allowed to ask for information on a case that they're not active with and so on. And even if they did have it, they're not allowed to share it and so on and so forth. Several weeks later, she calls me up and asks me to meet her in her office in the federal building. I go to her office. Her desk is completely clean except for a file that's about 1.5 inches thick. She goes, this is the file on that guy. I can't show it to you, of course. That's illegal. You understand that's illegal. Right now I have an appointment on the other side of the building that will last about an hour. If you want to wait here in my office, then we can talk about it more when I come back. And I said, I'll wait. And she left. She locked her office door. And I had all sorts of information, including his cell phone bills, all the numbers that he called. They had all sorts of tons and tons. They had every false passport that the guy used. They never arrested him because it was extremely easy to follow. And so it was better just to follow him around. See, because he's the lowest, he's the, they call him a mule, right? He's the lowest guy in the totem pole. They want to know who he's dealing with. And so they had all his flights, they had everything about him, and he disappears on a specific, there's a date where he flew from Caracas to Zurich, Zurich to Amsterdam. The last phone calls were made in Zurich and Amsterdam on his cell phone. Then he completely disappears. They never hear from him again. And that's it. All right? That's his story, according to this. There are all the people that he works for listed, including one guy in Amsterdam who arranges people to smuggle gems for you. Right? He's the broker with all his contact information. So I call him up and I say, I have this stuff in Los Angeles that I want to get to Tel Aviv. And I heard this guy is really reliable. I would like to hire him to take my merchandise for me. And the guy goes, no problem. He takes my information, calls me back about a week later and says it's impossible. And to decode what he said, because these people never speak, is that he stole some merchandise and he's no longer in this world. All right? And the dates that he had for this lined up with the time that he disappeared in Amsterdam. At this point, I call up my contact in the mob. And again, I'm hemming and hawing with him, and he says, this guy has to give his wife a get? I go, yeah. I said, he works in transportation in your business, looking for him. He has to give his wife a get. I said, yeah. I said, I'll get him for you. He calls me back a week later with more details. Of course, they're very, very well couched. You have to decode what he's saying, but it's exactly the same story. He was supposed to take the merchandise to Zurich, but he never got out of the airport in Zurich, and he flew to Amsterdam. He stole it there, where they caught up with him. And apparently they cut him up into little tiny pieces and threw him into the Rhine. So I had three sources maybe, for the same story, right? However, you would not normally say that these people are what you would call kosher witnesses, right? Not people that you give shlishi to. So,
We had the Tuchacha last week.
how do we look at testimony that comes from these people? And there is a tshuva from the time of the Cantonists in Tsarist Russia. People know what the Cantonists were?
I know.
The Tsar would draft Jewish boys between the age of 8 and 10 and make them serve in the army between 20 and 30 years, sometimes older, whatever, and an attempt to, kill them, basically. Way to kill off the Jewish people.
That's how I got my last name, and I'm not a Cohen, but my last name's Cohen, because if you had more than one child, you didn't have to serve. If you had one child, you didn't have to serve.
And so a woman would change her name.
So we took someone who didn't have children and took their last name.
That's how I got my last name.
Yeah.
Same
Well,
story with me.
you also find that a woman would not register her marriage until after her first child.
Hmm.
And then she would register her marriage. So her first boy. So her first two boys would have different names and would be exempt in that way. And Rabinovich was not in Russia a family name. It means son of the rabbi, which also could be an exemption. So one son of a rabbi would be called Rabinovich, which would exempt him, as well as the proper family name and so on. So you have many of these things that were done in different ways to avoid this. But one of these people was married from before he was taken into the Tsar's army, and at one point his mother writes to the camp where he is, asking them to give him leave to visit his wife. She hasn't seen him in a long time. She gets a letter back that they can't give him leave because he's dead. Died. Well, we didn't bother to tell you, but he's dead. So the question is this legitimate testimony that will allow us to let her remarry? Normally, when a non-Jew tells us something, their testimony is invalid, unless he's speaking without realizing that he's telling us anything about a value about this person. And he has to say it on his own. We can't question him. All right? So the Shut Tiferes Moshe wrote that the mother did not ask whether he was alive or not. She was asking him an entirely different question, and therefore it's still Messiach Lefi Tumo. So both of these people, or at least the smuggler, had no idea why I was approaching him, right? That what I was actually looking for was the guy, not smuggling. Therefore, and the second person, he's Jewish, but not exactly a tzaddik. And still, what he's doing is reinforcing the other testimony that he had no idea existed. So I wrote another tshuva.
Do Edom not need to be aware of their Edom?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on what it is. And we're not going to go into all of the conditions for such a thing right now. On this tshuva that I wrote, everyone agreed that it is possible, based upon this testimony, to allow this woman to get remarried. And she did get remarried in Eretz Yisrael a couple of years after that. And I did the chasana at Yeshiva Or Tzion, Drukman's Yeshiva, Tzitzal. And it was interesting because her family is a very well-known family in Muncie. And there were people that said that, they didn't like the Heter and they were going to stop the wedding from going on and so on. And it's a Hester Yeshiva, so you always have, well, not now, but normally you have guys there after the army. There's only one road into the village. So we had some guys learning at the entrance. And at a certain point, they joined the wedding, and they said there was a a passenger van full of Haredim that they came to the entrance, they saw all these guys learning, and they had their weapons with them. They just made a U-turn and went back to Yerushalayim. At that point, they said, our job's done. You come to the wedding. But if you work at it, you can find solutions. All right? We have reached what's supposed to be the end of our time. Next week, we are going to discuss more of the issues of where, for one reason or another, it is impossible to get the cooperation of the husband, but nonetheless, we are able to solve the problem in one way or another.